science, it was the motor that drove it. And I think we need to get back to seeing that that is the real source of modern scientific research. I believe that science does point towards God. And one of the strongest evidences for that from astronomy and cosmology is the so-called fine-tuning of the universe. I remember having a discussion with a very well-known Oxford philosopher who's an atheist, and he had asked me to address his students on why I believed in God, and he said, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism from science. And I said, well, if you tell me what it is, I'll use it. And he said, if ever I was to be persuaded to become a believer, it would be because of fine-tuning. Now, the idea here is that over the past 50 to 100 years, it has been discovered that not only is this Earth obviously a very special place in the sense that if we were further from our sun, life would not be possible because it would be too cold. If the Earth were near to the sun, it would not be possible because we're too hot, and many other things. But the fundamental constants of nature have turned out to be so accurately tuned in order to have life in the universe that the scientists themselves, whether they're atheists, Christians, or people of different worldviews, all think there's something here to be explained. Stephen Hawking, Lord Rees, who's our astronomer royal, and so on. They all think there's something there. And that intrigues me, and I believe there is something there. Now, in order to get away from the idea of fine-tuning, it's so improbable that you have to have some mechanism for increasing the probabilities. And one of the ways of doing that is the multiverse. From a scientific perspective, I was taught quantum physics by Sir John Polkinghorne, and he makes the point that the multiverse, these universes, are not accessible to us, and that it's much more natural to believe, and much more sensible, I would say, to believe in a single universe created by a creator rather than a multiverse to which we've no access and where there's no evidence that it exists. Now, a great deal has been written about this, but I find it's around the turn of the 20th century, so far as I understand it, the Aristotelian view still prevailed, and that is that the universe was eternal, and people believed essentially that it was static. They didn't think the stars moved very much. They weren't aware of other galaxies other than the Milky Way. So it was essentially an eternal static universe, and that was, of course, about to be changed. The Big Bang does not disprove the need for God or creator. That's a confusion of thought. The Big Bang is simply telling us we believe there was a beginning. That is what Genesis has been saying for thousands of years. The point is, Genesis is not only telling us that there was a beginning, it is also telling us what science cannot tell us, the ultimate cause of that beginning, which is God. So a Christian has nothing to fear from people using the words Big Bang, although, as I said earlier, they are misleading. You think of an explosion that makes a noise, which is very far from the basic idea. But let's grasp the central thing, which I find is marvelous. Because, as I've often said to physicists, look, it took you till the 1960s to come to believe that the universe had a beginning. I actually believed it myself before you did, because I have reasons for thinking that the biblical revelation is true. And what is more, if you had taken seriously the worldview of the Bible and weren't so committed to Aristotle, you might have looked for evidence for a beginning to space-time much earlier than you did. Now, this is very important because many scientists say, well, the Bible makes no predictions. Well, that's not quite true, because if you take its worldview seriously, here at the very start, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, if that's true, you can test it. And this is exactly what happened through Lemaitre, Hubble, and Penzias and Wilson. They were testing something that the Bible had stated. And isn't it interesting? It was Georges Lemaitre, a priest, who first led them to the idea. There are many things I think will remain beyond our knowledge. We don't know from a scientific perspective what consciousness is. We don't really know what energy is. And the basic things in the universe we find very difficult to know what they are. And some things may be unknowable. I'm perfectly happy with that. God has encouraged us, I believe, in Genesis to find things out. The mandate for doing science occurs in the early chapters of the Bible, where God told humans to name the animals. And that's taxonomy, which is the fundamental academic discipline. It applies to all disciplines, actually, naming things. And that's what we're trying to do with the early universe. But whether it can be done exhaustively is an open question. And I'm very happy with that. The universe has infinite potential for exploration. And of course, that keeps scientists in business. The idea of need is a very curious one. I'm interested in truth. Was there a creator or was there not a creator? Now, I know this is a popular view today because Hawking popularized it. There's no need for a creator. There's nothing for a creator to do. But I have analyzed his arguments very carefully. In fact, I've written a book about them called God and Stephen Hawking. And his method of getting rid of a creator, to my mind, does not work at all. Because what he does, and others do the same thing, like Lawrence Krauss of Arizona State University, they talk about the universe. Well, let me quote Hawking to you. He says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I first read that, and that's the key statement in the book by Hawking and Mlodinow, The Grand Design. That's the key statement. I was staggered because it's self-contradictory to start with. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction. And then to say the universe can create itself, that's logical nonsense. If I say that X creates Y, roughly speaking, I'm saying if you've got X, you may in the end get Y. But if I say X creates X, then that simply proves to me, sorry for being provocative, it simply proves to me that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists say it. So that's the second thing that's wrong with that statement. It is logical nonsense. But then the idea of nothing is fascinating. In fact, I give lectures on nothing these days because nothing turns out to be very interesting. Because how they get a universe from nothing is by redefining nothing. It's very hard to believe this, but Lawrence Krauss, in his book A Universe from Nothing, tells us fairly early on. He says this, because something is physical, nothing much must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. That is absolute foolish absurdity. Now, if you have to go to that extreme to get rid of God, you're not getting rid of God at all. You're not getting a universe from nothing, so you're failing spectacularly to solve the problem that Hawking and Krauss set up for themselves at the beginning of their books, and that is Leibniz's question, why is there something rather than nothing? And that's why I am not impressed by these attempts to say we don't need God. I think you do, because the very interesting thing is many of these people getting a universe from nothing, which doesn't work because their nothing is actually something, a quantum vacuum or something like that, will say the laws of nature do it. Well, where do they come from? They don't answer that question. So it seems to me that before we start, you need a God to structure the universe in such a way that it's got laws. And one of my main reasons for being a believer in God, apart from my Christianity, of course, is that science can be done. And science can be done as Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Clerk Maxwell, Babbage, and all those pioneers believed, because there's an intelligent God behind the universe. And C.S. Lewis put it brilliantly when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, a lawgiver. I often say to people, modern science in a very real way is the gift of the Judeo-Christian worldview to humanity. And that's why I'm not ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian simultaneously, because arguably it was Christianity gave me my worldview. And so Newton and company, they started, their belief in God did not hinder their science.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that the universe had a beginning, and that science, by its very nature, cannot explain the ultimate cause of that beginning, and I find this argument to be valid. The opening argument presented here is both scientifically responsible and philosophically precise. Lennox does not attempt to force God into the gaps of scientific ignorance. Instead, he carefully distinguishes between scientific description and metaphysical explanation. Science, by its methodology, is equipped to investigate how the universe began, the expansion of space-time, the cosmic background radiation, and the mathematical models surrounding the Big Bang. What it is not equipped to answer is why there is a universe at all, or why there is something rather than nothing. This is not a failure of science, but a recognition of its proper limits. Lennox's appeal to Genesis is often misunderstood by critics as a naive literalism. In fact, his point is far more subtle. Genesis does not function as a competing scientific theory. It functions as a worldview claim. It asserts that the universe is not eternal, not self-existent, and not accidental, but contingent upon an ultimate personal cause. What makes this argument particularly strong is its historical irony. The biblical worldview affirmed a cosmic beginning long before empirical science was prepared to accept it. The resistance to this idea was not scientific but philosophical, rooted in an Aristotelian commitment to an eternal universe. Once that philosophical barrier fell, the scientific evidence followed. This demonstrates a crucial insight. Science does not operate in a worldview vacuum. It is guided, often unconsciously, by metaphysical assumptions. When those assumptions shift, new questions become askable, and new discoveries become possible. Lennox's claim, therefore, is not that the Bible replaces science, but that a theistic worldview can meaningfully motivate scientific inquiry. The existence of a rational, intelligible universe is far more at home in a framework where mind precedes matter than in one where matter precedes mind. To deny this is not intellectual neutrality, it is philosophical amnesia. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion. This section addresses a widespread but rarely examined assumption in modern culture, the belief that science will eventually explain everything. Lennox challenges this assumption not by diminishing science, but by restoring intellectual honesty to it. The admission that certain realities may remain unknowable is not a concession to ignorance. It is a recognition of methodological boundaries. Concepts such as consciousness, energy, and the ultimate nature of reality resist complete reduction to equations or experimental procedures. This resistance does not signal failure. It signals depth. Modern scientism often confuses progress with completeness. The fact that science continually advances does not logically entail that it will one day exhaust all forms of knowledge. To assume otherwise is not science. It is metaphysics disguised as confidence. Lennox's reference to Genesis is particularly insightful here. The biblical mandate to name the animals is not anti-intellectual or anti-empirical. On the contrary, it establishes the foundation of taxonomy, the very act of categorization that underlies all scientific disciplines. This suggests that scientific inquiry is not threatened by belief in God, but encouraged by it. What Lennox quietly dismantles in this segment is the arrogance of epistemological totalitarianism, the idea that if something cannot be measured, it cannot be known. History repeatedly shows that some of humanity's most meaningful truths, moral obligations, rational laws, aesthetic values, are real even though they are not quantifiable. By acknowledging that the universe has infinite potential for exploration, Lennox affirms scientific curiosity while rejecting intellectual hubris. The open-endedness of knowledge is not a defect in the universe. It is an invitation to humility. In this light, faith and science are not rivals competing for territory. They are distinct modes of knowing, each answering different kinds of questions. When science forgets this, it stops being exploratory and becomes ideological. This segment represents one of the sharpest logical critiques of contemporary scientific atheism. Lennox is not attacking personalities. He is exposing contradictions. And contradictions, regardless of who utters them, remain contradictions. The claim that because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing, collapses under minimal logical scrutiny. First, a law is not nothing. A law presupposes structure, regularity, and intelligibility. To invoke a law as the explanatory engine of creation already assumes the existence of something rather than nothing. Second, the notion of self-creation is conceptually absurd. To say that X creates X is to violate the most basic principle of causality. Causes precede effects. A thing cannot bring itself into existence because it would need to exist in order to act. No amount of scientific prestige can rescue a statement that fails at the level of elementary logic. The redefinition of nothing is perhaps the most revealing move in this discussion. When nothing is quietly transformed into a quantum vacuum, a field governed by physical laws, or a state with energy potential, the argument has already conceded defeat. This is not nothing. It is something richly structured. Lennox correctly identifies this as a semantic maneuver rather than an explanation. Changing the meaning of a word does not solve a problem. It merely relocates it. The original philosophical question posed by Leibniz, why is there something rather than nothing, remains untouched. What is striking here is that the effort to remove God does not result in a simpler worldview. On the contrary, it results in a more convoluted one, filled with unexplained laws, redefined terms, and conceptual evasions. The attempt to avoid metaphysics ends up smuggling it back in, unacknowledged and unexamined. Lennox's critique is therefore not anti-scientific. It is anti-confusion. He insists that clarity, not complexity, is the mark of intellectual integrity. If one must distort logic to escape theism, the escape has already failed. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion. In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that the existence of the laws of nature and the rational intelligibility of science implicitly presuppose a mind behind the universe, and I find this argument to be valid. This portion of the dialogue moves the discussion from cosmology into epistemology. Lennox is no longer asking how the universe began, but why the universe is intelligible at all. This is a far deeper question than it first appears. The assumption that the universe operates according to stable, discoverable laws is not something science proves. It is something science assumes. Without this assumption, experimentation would be meaningless, prediction impossible, and explanation incoherent. Science can describe laws, but it cannot account for their existence. When some claim that the laws of nature did it, they quietly bypass the most important question. Where did the laws come from? Laws do not cause anything by themselves. They describe regularities. They do not generate reality. Gravity, for example, explains how objects behave once they exist, not why anything exists in the first place. Lennox's argument is compelling because it exposes a category mistake. To treat laws as creative agents is to confuse description with causation. A law is not a thing, it is a statement about how things behave. Without a universe, laws have nothing to govern. The historical observation that modern science emerged within a Judeo-Christian framework is not accidental. Early scientists believed the universe was rational because it was created by a rational God. They expected order because they believed in a lawgiver. This expectation was not derived from experimentation, it preceded it. This worldview did not hinder scientific inquiry, it energized it. It gave scientists confidence that the universe could be understood, that nature was not capricious, and that human reason could meaningfully correspond to the structure of reality. The irony of modern scientism is that it continues to rely on these assumptions while denying their foundation. It inherits the fruits of a theistic worldview while rejecting the tree that bore them. Lennox's point is not that science proves God, but that science makes far more sense in a universe grounded in intelligence than in one grounded in blind necessity. Rational order is not an illusion we impose on chaos. It is a feature we discover, and discovery itself demands explanation.
Hence, it was the motor that drove it. And I think we need to get back to seeing that that is the real source of modern scientific research. I believe that science does point towards God. And one of the strongest evidences for that from astronomy and cosmology is the so-called fine-tuning of the universe. I remember having a discussion with a very well-known Oxford philosopher who's an atheist. And he had asked me to address his students on why I believed in God. And he said, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism from science. And I said, well, if you tell me what it is, I'll use it. And he said, if ever I was to be persuaded to become a believer, it would be because of fine-tuning. Now, the idea here is that over the past 50 to 100 years, it has been discovered that not only is this Earth obviously a very special place in the sense that if we were further from our sun, life would not be possible because it would be too cold. If the Earth were near to the sun, it would not be possible because we're too hot, and many other things. But the fundamental constants of nature have turned out to be so accurately tuned in order to have life in the universe that the scientists themselves, whether they're atheists, Christians, or people of different worldviews, all think there's something here to be explained. Stephen Hawking, Lord Rees, who's our astronomer royal, and so on. They all think there's something there. And that intrigues me, and I believe there is something there. Now, in order to get away from the idea of fine-tuning, it's so improbable that you have to have some mechanism for increasing the probabilities. And one of the ways of doing that is the multiverse. From a scientific perspective, I was taught quantum physics by Sir John Polkinghorne, and he makes the point that the multiverse, these universes, are not accessible to us, and that it's much more natural to believe, and much more sensible, I would say, to believe in a single universe created by a creator rather than a multiverse to which we've no access and where there's no evidence that it exists. Now, a great deal has been written about this, but I find it's a
This segment marks the intellectual summit of the entire discussion. Lennox is no longer defending theism against criticism. He is presenting a positive, empirically grounded case that demands explanation from all worldviews, including atheism. Fine-tuning refers to the discovery that the fundamental constants of nature, the strength of gravity, electromagnetic force, nuclear forces, and numerous initial conditions, fall within an extraordinarily narrow range that allows life to exist. Alter them even slightly, and the universe becomes sterile. This is not a theological claim. It is a conclusion widely acknowledged within contemporary physics. What gives this argument unusual weight is Lennox's honesty. He openly admits that fine-tuning troubles thoughtful atheists as much as it encourages theists. The question, therefore, is not whether fine-tuning exists, but how it should be interpreted. Chance in its raw form offers no explanatory power here. When probabilities collapse to near zero, appealing to luck ceases to be rational and becomes evasive. The more precise the tuning, the less credible pure chance becomes as an explanation. Lennox does not claim that fine-tuning forces belief in God. Rather, he insists that it forces intellectual responsibility. Any adequate worldview must account for why the universe appears deliberately calibrated for complexity, order, and life. The strength of this argument lies in its neutrality. It does not rely on religious texts or doctrinal commitments. It emerges from mainstream science itself. That is why Lennox can confidently state that one does not need to go against the flow of science to raise this question. One needs only to follow it honestly. Fine-tuning exposes a deep fracture in materialist explanations. Either reality is underwritten by mind, or we must accept an explosion of speculative mechanisms designed solely to avoid that conclusion. The former is philosophically simpler, scientifically consonant, and intellectually transparent. In this light, fine-tuning is not a God of the gaps argument. It is a worldview test. It reveals which frameworks can absorb the data without distortion, and which must multiply assumptions to preserve their commitments. This final section brings the discussion to a point of intellectual clarity. Lennox contrasts two explanatory frameworks: a single universe grounded in intentional creation, and a multiverse proposed to dilute improbability. The multiverse is not rejected here on emotional or theological grounds, but on epistemic ones. By definition, other universes in a multiverse are inaccessible. They cannot be observed, tested, or falsified. As such, they function not as scientific explanations, but as speculative constructs. This does not mean the multiverse is logically impossible. It means that its explanatory power is conditional and costly. It multiplies entities beyond necessity, and does so precisely at the point where fine-tuning becomes uncomfortable. The timing of its invocation is philosophically revealing. Lennox's critique is subtle but devastating. If one is willing to posit an infinite number of unseen universes to avoid the inference of design, one has already abandoned the demand for empirical restraint. The appeal to the multiverse is therefore not a triumph of scientific rigor, but a retreat into metaphysical excess. In contrast, the hypothesis of a creator does not add explanatory clutter. It unifies the data under a single coherent cause, a rational source capable of grounding laws, constants, and intelligibility. Whether one accepts this explanation or not, it has the virtue of conceptual economy. The real issue, then, is not science versus faith, but explanatory honesty. Which framework best accounts for the evidence without redefining terms, multiplying unobservables, or insulating itself from critique? Lennox leaves the listener with a choice, not a compulsion, but it is a choice that reveals one's intellectual priorities. Whether one values simplicity, coherence, and evidence, or whether one prefers complexity designed to preserve prior commitments.